1985, Victoria Street, Richmond, Melbourne. The last day at Vickers Ruwolt. The heavy machining bays are being cleared. Overhead cranes stop mid-lift. The gear-cutting machines that Vickers Ruwolt built in its own machine tool shop are being crated. Their destination: Carrabin, Ipswich, Queensland, 1,700 kilometres north, approximately noon. Workers file out of the Victoria Street gate. Fitters, turners, boilermakers, pattern makers. Some have been at the Richmond works for 30 years, some for 40. By evening, the 10-acre riverside site is empty. Overhead lights out. Gates locked. The Yarra River flows past, unchanged. 83 years earlier, a 29-year-old German-born blacksmith named Charles Ruwolt had opened his first foundry in Wangaratta. 2 years from now, the entire operation will belong to a Sydney holding company. 10 years from now, the Ruwolt name will be extinguished. 18 years from now, a shopping centre will open on this ground. Not because the workers failed, not because the machines wore out, not because the mining and power and sugar industries stopped ordering. Because 42 years earlier, in 1941, Vickers Ruwolt built its first crusher frame for BHP, and in 1983, BHP bought the company that made it. If you ever machined a gear at Vickers Ruwolt, apprenticed at Richmond, or watched an 11-tonne casting leave the Yarra Riverside Gate for the Snowy or the Latrobe or Mount Isa, hit subscribe. This channel keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. The Last Day. The men and women on the Richmond factory floor know what today is. They have known for months, since the Comsteel Vickers Ltd board decision to close the Richmond facility entirely and consolidate heavy fabrication, machining and fitting to the Carrabin site at Ipswich, Queensland. Some have been offered relocation packages. Most have not. At approximately noon on the last day, the machining bays fall silent for the final time. Vickers Ruwolt, at its Australian peak, through the mid-1970s, employed approximately 4,000 people across its divisions. Richmond itself carried between 600 and 1,000 workers continuously through the post-war decades. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records Charles Ruwolt's original firm as one of Australia's largest engineering firms by the late 1930s. The gear-cutting machines that Vickers Ruwolt built in its own machine tool shop, some the largest of their type in the Southern Hemisphere, by living memory account, are being crated for the 1,700-kilometre road journey to Carrabin, deep in the Ipswich industrial belt west of Brisbane. The 10-acre riverside site that Charles Ruwolt bought as former market gardens in 1912 stands empty. The overhead cranes that lifted 22.5-tonne Yallourn power station main columns in the Doonside Street boiler shop are still. The pattern shop where the wooden templates for the mining crushers were carved is dark. 2 years from now, the entire Comsteel Vickers Ltd corporate entity will belong to Sydney Holding Company Australian National Industries, ANI. 10 years from now, the Ruwolt name will be dropped in an ANI merger. 18 years from now, on the 3rd of April 2003, Victoria Garden Shopping Centre will open on this ground. 37,699 square metres of retail floor space, an IKEA anchor tenant, and shoppers pushing trolleys where Charles Ruwolt Pty Ltd once forged the 25-pounder artillery that armed Australia's Pacific War divisions. But this story does not begin at the Victoria Street Gate in 1985. It begins 83 years earlier in a country town northeast of Melbourne with the German-born blacksmith who had already worked in every serious foundry in colonial Australia. Chapter 2. Wangaratta, 1902. 1873. Germany. Charles Ernest Ruwolt is born. He arrives in Australia as a boy with his family, educated in South Australia. At the age of 13 in 1886, he is apprenticed to James Martin and Company at Gawler, South Australia, a locomotive, agricultural machinery and mining equipment foundry that had been building railway rolling stock and mining ore processing plant since the 1860s. Martin's was one of the largest engineering works in colonial South Australia. Now Martin's is training Charles Ruwolt. 4 years of apprenticeship. Cast iron, wrought iron, machining, pattern making, forge work, boiler shop work. By 1890, Charles Ruwolt is a qualified fitter and turner. 17 years old, he moves through the great Victorian colonial foundries. Phoenix Foundry, Ballarat, building steam locomotives for the Victorian railways in the shadow of the goldfields. Austral Otis Elevator Company, Melbourne, building lifts for the boom-era commercial buildings of Collins Street and Burke Street. Thompson's of Castlemaine, building mining machinery for the Bendigo and Ballarat quartz reefs. Thompson's was one of the largest colonial foundries in Victoria. By the turn of the century, Ruwolt has worked in the best heavy engineering shops in colonial Australia. He is 29 years old, 1902. Charles Ruwolt opens his own iron foundry. Wangaratta, northeastern Victoria, country town on the Ovens River, approximately 240 kilometres northeast of Melbourne. Wheat and tobacco district, alluvial gold dredging country beyond, in the Ovens Valley and toward Bright. Ruwolt starts with windmills, farm machinery repairs, steam engines for the tobacco kilns, boiler work for the wheat mills. His first year's turnover would not have covered the wages bill of a Ballarat locomotive shop, 1906. Ruwolt diversifies into bucket dredge repair. The Ovens Valley gold dredgers, Depression-era survivors of the alluvial gold rush, need constant heavy engineering support, steel bucket lips, chain drives, cast iron gear wheels. Ruwolt's foundry becomes the go-to workshop for the northeastern Victorian gold dredging fleet, 1908. Ruwolt merges with New Zealand dredge engineer Isaac Stevenson's Bright workshop. Together, they manufacture complete gold and tin dredgers, no longer just repairing them. The dredgers are exported to Malaya, Siam, the Philippines, South Africa and New Guinea. The Wangaratta foundry is now an international heavy machinery exporter. By 1910, Ruwolt employs 40 men at Wangaratta. He is 37 years old, 1910. Charles Ruwolt Proprietary Company Limited is formally registered. Ruwolt looks south toward Melbourne. Country town foundry work has its ceiling. To build the biggest heavy engineering business in Australia, he needs to be beside a port, beside a railhead, beside a river with barge access, beside the largest concentration of Australian industrial customers. 1912. January. Construction begins on a 10-acre former market garden site on Victoria Street, Richmond, beside the Yarra River, 5 kilometres east of Melbourne, Central Business District. By 1920, the Wangaratta boy from South Australia had built one of the largest heavy engineering works in Australia, on the banks of the Yarra, in inner Melbourne, on land that would still be Vickers Ruwolt 65 years later, and a shopping centre 30 years after that. Chapter 3. Victoria Street, 1914. The Richmond registered office is operational. Foundry, forge, machine shop, pattern shop, offices, all on the 10-acre riverside site at Victoria Street, Burnley End, November 1920. Charles Ruwolt Proprietary Company Limited becomes a public company. Nominal capital £250,000. Directors listed at company registration. Charles Ruwolt as Managing Director, Rupert Ruwolt, Charles's son, as Director and long-serving employees. A.I. Beard and Ellis H. Davies rounding out the board. 1922. Product diversification, road-making equipment, steamrollers, graders, aggregate crushers for the Country Roads Board of Victoria, mining crushers for the Broken Hill silver-lead mines, brewing machinery for Carltonton and United Breweries and Foster's. Hydraulic presses for the nascent Australian car body industry, Ford at Geelong. Holden's Bodybuilders at Woodville, in Adelaide. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Ruwolt supplies major infrastructure, power station equipment for the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, turbine casings, boiler frames, cooling tower structural steel for the Yallourn Brown Coal Complex in the Latrobe Valley east of Melbourne, cement industry equipment for Australian Cement Company, kiln components, ball mill shells, slurry pumps, sugar mill rollers for the Queensland sugar mills at Mossman, Innisfail, Mackay and Bundaberg. By 1938, the Richmond Works covers 20 acres of the Burnley riverfront. Workforce between 600 and 700 men. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records the firm as one of Australia's largest engineering firms by the late 1930s. Products in 1938: rock crushers, jaw crushers, giratory crushers, ball mills, rod mills, hydraulic presses, gears, forgings, castings up to 22 tonnes per piece. The Yallourn power station main columns, 22.5 tonnes apiece, are fabricated in the Doonside Street boiler shop and rail freighted east to the Latrobe Valley. Australia's heavy engineering capacity in 1938 is concentrated across a small number of firms: Ruwolt at Richmond, Thompson's at Castlemaine, Kelly and Lewis at Springvale, John Hine and Son at Redfern in Sydney, F.W. Hercus at Adelaide. Together, these 5 firms build most of the heavy machinery Australia does not import. Ruwolt is among the largest. Charles Ruwolt is 65 years old. And on the 11th of June 1940, 19 months after Robert Menzies had declared it his melancholy duty that Britain and Australia were at war with Germany, the 67-year-old German-born industrialist was appointed to Essington Lewis's Victorian Munitions Board. Chapter 4, Iron Work, May 1940. Melbourne. Prime Minister Robert Menzies appoints Essington Lewis, Managing Director of the Broken Hill Proprietary Company, as Director General of Munitions. On the wall of Lewis's office at Munitions Headquarters in Melbourne, framed in block capitals, I am work. This is Essington Lewis's personal creed, not a Ruwolt Company motto, but Charles Ruwolt worked to it. The 11th of June, 1940. The Department of Munitions is formally established. June 1940. Charles Ruwolt, 67 years old, German-born, naturalised Australian for decades, is appointed to the Victorian Board of Area Management of the Department of Munitions, one of 8 members, coordinating Melbourne heavy engineering capacity for the war effort. Charles Ruwolt Proprietary Company Limited becomes number 1 annex of munitions supply, making light artillery, trench mortars, gun-howitzers, tank attack guns, mortar bombs, armour-piercing shot. The signature program, the Ordnance quick-firing 25-pounder field gun howitzer, Australia's standard field artillery piece from 1941 to the Vietnam era. Ruwolt at Richmond and General Motors Holden's at Pagewood in Sydney are the 2 principal commercial contractors. Local production begins May 1941. Ruwolt is coordinating contractor and recognising the difficulty of the recuperator keeps that critical hydro-pneumatic component in-house. To end 1943, total Australian 25-pounder output. Government Ordnance Factory at Maribyrnong, 1,173 complete ordnance plus 230 spare barrels. Industry, meaning Ruwolt and General Motors Holden combined, 354 complete ordnance plus 445 spare barrels. 1942. Ruwolt collaborates with the Army Design Section on the 25-pounder short Australian Mark I, the Baby 25-pounder, which broke into 10 parachute droppable pieces for jungle warfare in New Guinea, Bougainville, Borneo. 213 built. Ruwolt also produces the tank mounting for the proposed Australian cruiser Mark III tank at Chullora, a program that produced only 1 prototype before cancellation. 1942. Peak workforce at Richmond, approximately 2,000 men and women. Consider what that means. Charles Ruwolt, the German-born blacksmith who had built his foundry from a Wangaratta country workshop into a 2,000-worker munitions annex, was building the artillery that armed Australia against the country of his birth. 1941. Museum's Victoria's Vickers Ruwolt collection holds a glass negative photographed at the Richmond Works. Title: Upper part of crusher side frame for BHP. Charles Ruwolt, Proprietary Company Limited, is fabricating heavy crusher components for the Broken Hill proprietary company's Newcastle Steelworks. Even during the war, while the 25-pounder line runs, Ruwolt fills BHP's peacetime crusher orders. Read that again. BHP is Ruwolt's customer. 1941. On the record, documented, held in a public collection, 4th of November 1946. Charles Ruwolt dies at his Toorak home. Estate sworn for probate at £157,557. His son, Rupert Ruwolt, director since the company's public listing in 1920, continues in a senior director role. 2 years later, the Richmond Works passes into British hands. Chapter 5. The Empire, 1948. London. Vickers Limited, one of Britain's great industrial conglomerates, the name that runs from the Vickers machine gun of the Somme to the Vickers Viscount airliner, is consolidating its Australian heavy engineering interests. Vickers Limited buys Charles Ruwolt Proprietary Company Limited for £750,000 sterling, approximately equivalent to over £30 million sterling in 2026 purchasing power, a significant corporate acquisition in post-war Australia. The firm is renamed Vickers Ruwolt. The letterhead changes, the stationery changes, the company badge on the Yarra Riverside gates changes. Rupert Ruwolt continues in a director role for a period, then departs. Here's the thing, in the family's telling and in the trade press coverage of 1948, the sale was described as a merger and a strategic partnership. It was not a merger, it was a purchase. Vickers Limited owned 100% of the Australian operation. From 1948, every strategic decision about the Richmond Works was made ultimately in London. The countdown had started. No one in Melbourne yet knew what the timer was set to. It would run for 35 years, 1948 to 1973. The post-war civil engineering peak. Yallourn Power Station. Main columns 22.5 tonnes apiece, fabricated at Richmond for the State Electricity Commission of Victoria. Photographed in the Doonside Street Boiler Shop, January 1951. The steel spine of the Latrobe Valley Brown Coal Complex that would power Melbourne for the next 50 years. The Kiwa Hydro-Electric Scheme. SEC Victoria contracts for turbine casings and heavy structural steel components. The mining industry. Vickers Ruwolt becomes Australia's principal supplier of heavy grinding mills and rock crushers. Autogenous and semi-autogenous grinding mills up to 5.3 metres by 5.6 metres. 60-inch by 48-inch underground jaw crushers, one of which operates at Cobar mines in New South Wales into the 2020s. Ball mills, rod mills, gyratory crushers, supplied to Mount Isa, to Broken Hill, to Kalgoorlie, to the Bowen Basin coalfields of central Queensland. Every serious Australian mine of scale through the 1960s ran Vickers Ruwolt equipment somewhere on its ore processing circuit. Every state electricity commission bought Vickers Ruwolt structural steel. Every serious Queensland sugar mill ordered Vickers Ruwolt rollers on rotation. The BHP relationship continues. Vickers Ruwolt fabricates crusher components, forgings, mill rollers and steel castings for BHP's Newcastle Steelworks and the Port Kembla plant across the 1950s and 1960s. Newcastle orders, Port Kembla orders. The relationship deepens across 2 decades of post-war Australian steel demand. Read that again. BHP is Vickers Ruwolt's customer continuously from 1941 through the 1970s. The sugar industry. Vickers Ruwolt manufactures cast iron sugar mill rollers with forged steel shafts, the shrink-fit assembly that crushes cane in every Queensland mill from Mossman in the far north to Rocky Point on the Gold Coast. Machine tools. Vickers Ruwolt builds its own heavy machine tools, large planers, radial drilling machines, gear cutting machines, in the plant it uses to make everything else. By the mid-1970s, Vickers Ruwolt division of Vickers Australia Limited employs approximately 4,000 people across Australia. Richmond alone carries between 600 and 1,000 continuously through the post-war decades. Let that number sit for a moment. 4,000 people. Working for a single Australian heavy engineering firm. Building the crushers, mills, forgings and gears that dug the coal, milled the cane, generated the electricity and framed the power stations that built modern Australia. And in 1967, a German-born Australian industrial photographer walked into the Richmond machining bay with his camera. If you have made it this far through the Wangaratta foundry floor, the Doonside Street boiler shop, the 25-pounder assembly line and the mining crushers that dug half of modern Australia, hit the like button and subscribe. This channel keeps these stories alive. Vickers Ruwolt payslip, AMWU delegate card or trainee fitter indenture, drop it in the comments. Chapter 6. The British Countdown. 1948 to 1983. 35 years of British ownership. Vickers Ltd, the London industrial parent, kept the Richmond works profitable through the 1950s and 1960s. Investment continued. Machine tools were upgraded. The workforce grew. What did not change? Strategic control. The Ruwolt name persisted on the Victoria Street gate. The badge on the letterhead read Vickers Ruwolt. But the ultimate boardroom was Vickers House on Millbank in London. 1960. Vickers Ltd restructures its Australian operations into Vickers Australia Limited. The Richmond Works becomes the Vickers Ruwolt division of that holding structure. Corporate simplification. Same ownership, same countdown. 1967. Britain devalues the pound sterling. Vickers Ltd's overseas subsidiaries, including Vickers Australia, become relatively more expensive to fund from London. By the mid-1970s, British Aircraft Corporation nationalisation looms. The Vickers Aircraft Division at Weybridge will be lost to British Aerospace under the Aircraft and Shipbuilding Industries Act. 1977. The Aircraft and Shipbuilding Industries Act passes. Vickers Armstrongs. Its aviation, shipbuilding and steel operations are nationalised. British Aerospace absorbs the aircraft. British Shipbuilders absorbs the yards. British Steel absorbs the steel. Vickers plc, the remaining private company, is left with defence, marine and a scattered portfolio of civil engineering subsidiaries. Vickers Australia is on that scattered list. 1980. Sir David Plastow, formerly of Rolls-Royce Motors, takes over as Chief Executive Officer of Vickers plc. Plastow restructures hard. Nearly half of the Vickers plc portfolio of subsidiaries is shed across the early 1980s. The company refocuses on defence and marine, the businesses that would later become BAE Systems Marine and Vickers Defence Systems. Vickers Australia, Vickers Ruwolt included, is quietly reclassified from strategic core to peripheral on asset. The countdown had entered its final phase. No one in Richmond yet knew what the timer was set to, but in 1967, right in the middle of the British ownership period, right at the peak of the post-war civil engineering boom, right before the Vickers plc retreat began, a Berlin-born Australian industrial photographer walked into the Richmond machining bay with his camera and made the photograph that would outlive everything. Chapter 7. Sievers, 1967. 1967. Victoria Street, Richmond. The Vickers Ruwolt machining bay. Wolfgang Sievers, born the 27th of September 1913, Berlin. Fled Nazi Germany in 1938. Arrived in Melbourne. Naturalised Australian. Photographed Australian industry across 5 decades. BHP Steelworks at Newcastle and Port Kembla. The Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. Mount Isa Mines. The John Lissart rolling mills at Chullarata and Newcastle. Sievers' mission, in his own words from his archive, was to create a symbolic photograph of Australia's engineering manufacturing skills, to show the world outside that Australia was not merely a continent of raw materials. He walks into the Vickers Ruwolt machining bay at the Burnley end of Victoria Street, overhead cranes, the smell of cutting oil, the percussive rhythm of the gear-cutting machines, the pattern shop next door, the forge beyond. He photographs the gears, cast-iron mining gears machined to precision, ready for shipment, massive, wrapped in protective grease, bound for Mount Isa, Broken Hill, Kalgoorlie, the Bowen Basin. The photograph is titled Gears for the Mining Industry, Vickers Ruwolt, Burnley. The image becomes Sievers' signature Australian industrial photograph. Prints enter the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra, the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney, the National Gallery of Victoria on St Kilda Road, the Art Gallery of South Australia in Adelaide. 1989. Sievers reprints the photograph in a limited edition of silver gelatin prints. 6th of May, 2015. Deutsche and Hackett, Auction 39. Melbourne, Lot 121. A 50 by 39.5 centimetre silver gelatin print of gears for the mining industry. Vickers Ruwolt, Burnley. Auction estimate $3,000 to $5,000 Australian dollars. Hammer price $11,400 Australian dollars, including buyer's premium. The image outlives the factory by nearly 40 years and counting. 2007. Wolfgang Sievers dies at his Melbourne home, aged 93. And 6 years after Sievers made his photograph, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam went on national television at 7 p.m. on the 18th of July 1973 and announced the tariff cut that would begin to unravel the Richmond works. Chapter 8. 18th July, 18th of July, 1973, 7 p.m, Canberra. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and Trade Minister Jim Cairns announce a 25% across-the-board SAT to all Australian import tariffs. Effective midnight, Prime Ministerial Transcript 2971. Whitlam's words: each tariff will be reduced by 1/4 of what it is now. This reduction will apply forthwith. The Whitlam tariff cut had been drafted by a 4-man committee: Tariff Board Chairman Alf Rattigan, Australian National University economist Fred Gruen, Monash University economist Brian Brogan, and public servant Stuart Harris, meeting in a Canberra hotel on the 27th of June, 1973. Treasury Secretary John Stone had not been consulted. Impact on heavy engineering. Imported crushers, mills, gears and forgings enter the Australian market at 75% of the prior tariff wall. Australian heavy engineering firms face progressive margin collapse across the mid to late 1970s. Melbourne engineering histories explicitly identify the 25% cut as the trigger. Established firms: Vickers Ruwolt, Kelly and Lewis at Springvale, Jacques at Highett, Thompson's at Castlemaine, begin the slow rationalisation process that will see them absorbed by larger corporations and closing their Melbourne works across the subsequent decade. The dominoes fall in sequence. Kelly and Lewis is absorbed and its Melbourne works progressively wound down. Jacques passes through corporate hands until closure of its Hyatt works. Thompson's of Castlemaine is absorbed and eventually closed. The Melbourne heavy engineering ecosystem, the machine shops, the pattern makers, the specialist steel suppliers, the AMWU apprentice pipeline, contracts progressively through the late 1970s. Vickers Ruwolt survives the immediate post-1973 period. The mining boom of the late 1970s, Bowen Basin coal, Pilbara iron ore, the central Queensland copper and zinc mines, carries the crusher and grinding mill order book through 1978 and 1979. The BHP relationship continues. Newcastle steelworks orders, Port Kembla orders, component fabrication for the BHP Steel Division. 1980. Sir David Plastow takes over Vickers plc. The London-based retreat from peripheral heavy engineering accelerates. Vickers Australia becomes a candidate for divestment. 1981. 1982. Vickers Australia's Richmond Steel Foundry begins winding down. The Perth-based Hadwa Steel Foundry, another Vickers Australia division, closes. By early 1983, Vickers plc is looking for an Australian partner or buyer. And the largest Australian customer of Vickers Ruwolt, the customer that had ordered crusher frames from Richmond continuously since 1941, was BHP 1983. BHP and Vickers plc announced a merger of their Australian heavy engineering interests. 35 years after the Vickers Limited purchase of the Richmond Works, 42 years after Charles Ruwolt Proprietary Company Limited fabricated its first crusher side frame for BHP. Chapter 9. The Merger. 1983. Melbourne. BHP House, 140 William Street. Vickers plc London and the Broken Hill Proprietary Company Melbourne announce a merger of their Australian heavy engineering interests. The mechanics. Commonwealth Steel Company, Comsteel, the BHP-controlled Waratah. Newcastle, forgings and casting specialist founded in 1917, is merged with Vickers Australia's operations to form Comsteel Vickers Limited. Shareholding, BHP 38%. Vickers plc 38%. Smaller investors 24%. BHP's Comsteel shareholding is cut from 86% to 38% in the process. BHP is not increasing its steel division exposure. BHP is diluting its Comsteel stake into a larger merged entity, using Vickers Australia's assets as ballast for the enlarged Comsteel Vickers Limited. Vickers plc has effectively sold its Australian heavy engineering exposure to BHP for a 38% share of a merged entity BHP will progressively control. Vickers Ruwolt, the Richmond Works, is now a division of Comsteel Vickers Limited. The Ruwolt name persists on the letterhead. The Vickers name persists in the corporate parent. But strategic control has moved from London to Melbourne, specifically to BHP House at 140 William Street, the 41-storey headquarters that dominates the Melbourne Central Business District. Sir James McNeill is BHP chairman, born 1916 at Hamilton, New South Wales. Accountant by training, the first BHP managing director in the company's history to reach that position without an engineering background. He has held the BHP chairmanship since 1977. His portrait hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra. His signature is on the merger papers. Brian Loton is BHP Managing Director. He has held the role since 1982. Metallurgist by training, he is overseeing a decade-long, approximately $22 billion rationalisation of BHP's steel division. In 1983 alone, nearly one-third of BHP Steel Division employees are made redundant. The Comsteel Vickers merger fits into the wider Loton rationalisation program: consolidation, cost reduction, balance sheet efficiency. In the 28-page annual report language of BHP 1983, strategic realignment. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. BHP had been Vickers Ruwolt's customer since 1941. Documented. Museums Victoria holds the glass negative upper part of crusher side frame for BHP photographed at Richmond in 1941. 42 years earlier, Charles Ruwolt Proprietary Company Limited made the crusher frames for BHP's Newcastle steelworks. In 1983, BHP bought 38% of the company that had made them and would progressively acquire operational control. 42 years between the customer relationship and the corporate absorption. Here's the thing. The 1983 merger was announced in the Australian Financial Review as a strategic rationalisation of Australian heavy engineering. On the Australian Stock Exchange, Comsteel Vickers Ltd traded as a merger success story. In the reality of the Richmond shop floor, it was the countdown to closure. 2 years after the merger, Comsteel Vickers Ltd would make the decision to close the Richmond works entirely. Chapter 10. The Closure. 1985. Comsteel Vickers Ltd boardroom. The decision is made. Close the Richmond facility entirely. Move heavy fabrication, machining and fitting to the Carabin site at Ipswich, Queensland, 1,700 kilometres north. 1985. The Richmond work stands down. The gear-cutting machines are crated. The overhead cranes lift final loads onto rail trucks bound for Queensland. The pattern shop is emptied. The forge is banked down. January 1986. The workshop relocation to Carabin is complete. The Richmond 10-acre riverside site stands empty. Contaminated soil. Redundant structures. A Yarra side land parcel that inner Melbourne developers would begin circling within 12 months. 4th of June 1986. Australian National Industries, ANI, a Sydney-based industrial holding company, acquires Comsteel Vickers Ltd from BHP and Vickers plc. The engineering arm is renamed ANI Ruwolt. ANI is buying a corporate shell. The Richmond works is already closed. The Carabin site is operational. The Ruwolt name persists on the letterhead, but no longer on any Melbourne factory gate. 1995. ANI Ruwolt merges into ANI Engineering, part of the Bradken Group. The Ruwolt name is dropped 93 years after Charles Ruwolt opened his Wangaratta foundry, 47 years after Vickers Ltd bought the works, 12 years after the BHP merger, 10 years after the Richmond closure. The Ruwolt name is extinguished. The subsequent corporate lineage, Bradken, ANI Bradken, 1995. The Smorgon Steel takeover of ANI in 1999. Castle Harlan, private equity and ASX relisting in 2004, and in 2016 and 2017, acquired by Hitachi Construction Machinery, based in Tokyo. Even the industrial afterlife ends offshore. Meanwhile, the Richmond site sits empty for nearly 20 years. Contaminated soil remediation, heritage constraints, industrial to residential rezoning negotiations, property developers circling, Salter. Properties, vicinity centres, the developer consortium that would eventually take the site. Thursday, the 3rd of April, 2003. A shopping centre opens on the ground where Vickers Ruwolt once forged Australia's 25-pounder artillery, Yallourn's power station columns and Mount Isa's mining gears. Chapter 11. Victoria Gardens. Walk into Victoria Gardens Shopping Centre on Victoria Street, Richmond, today, 6 kilometres east of Melbourne's Central Business District. The Yarra River flows past, unchanged. 37,699 square metres of retail floor space. 2,173 car parks. Approximately 80 specialty retailers. The IKEA store, the only IKEA in Melbourne at its 2003 opening, is the anchor tenant. The centre officially opened on Thursday the 3rd of April 2003. An $80 million Salta Properties and Vicinity Centres joint venture, 18 years after the last workers walked out the Victoria Street gate. Directly beneath the shopper's feet, 65 years earlier, a fitter and turner stood at a radial drilling machine that Vickers Ruwolt had built in its own machine tool bay. 50 metres north of the current IKEA loading dock, the boiler shop where the 22.5-tonne Yallourn power station main column was photographed on a January morning in 1951. 100 metres east, the machining bay where Wolfgang Sievers made his photograph in 1967. That photograph now hangs in the National Gallery of Australia on the Kingston foreshore in Canberra, 660 kilometres northeast of Richmond. Every year, tens of thousands of visitors see the gears. On the ground where they were made, other visitors buy flat-pack furniture. The gates are gone. The foundry is a mall. Here's the kicker. In May 2015, a 50 by 39.5 centimetre silver gelatin print of Sievers gears for the mining industry sold at Deutsche and Hackett on Auction 39 in Melbourne for 11,400 Australian dollars, including buyer's premium. The photograph, a single image from a limited edition, is worth more per square centimetre than the 10-acre site the foundry stood on per equivalent area. A further $900 million mixed-use redevelopment, Riverworks, is planned for the broader site. 1,679 one, two and three-bedroom apartments across more than 6 buildings, some up to 17 stories tall. 45,000 square metres of new retail and commercial space. The retained heritage element, the Loyal Studley Hotel, a 19th century pub across the road from where the foundry gates used to be. Lesson 1. The British takeover was the beginning of the end. In 1948, Vickers Limited of the United Kingdom bought Charles Ruwolt Proprietary Company Limited for £750,000 sterling. In Melbourne, the sale was reported as a merger and a strategic partnership. In the corporate reality, it was a purchase. 100% British-owned from 1948 onwards. Every strategic decision, the products, the investment, the workforce, the survival, was made ultimately in London. The countdown had started. It would run for 35 years. In 1983, the countdown reached zero, and Vickers plc sold its Australian heavy engineering interests to BHP in the Comsteel Vickers merger. 2 years after that, the Richmond works closed. The Ruwolt family did not know in 1948 what the timer was set to, neither did the workforce. Neither did the customers. But the timer was already running the moment the £750,000 changed hands. Lesson 2. The customer became the executioner. In 1941, Charles Ruwolt Proprietary Company Limited made the crusher side frames for BHP's Newcastle steelworks. The relationship continued through the war, through the post-war boom, through the 1948 Vickers acquisition, through the 1950s and 1960s Yallourn contracts, through Wolfgang Sievers' photograph in 1967, through the Whitlam tariff cut in 1973. For 42 years, BHP was Vickers Ruwolt's customer. In 1983, BHP became the entity that absorbed Vickers Ruwolt into Comsteel Vickers Ltd. 2 years after that, the Richmond works closed. The company that had made BHP's crushers for 42 years was killed by BHP. Sir James McNeill signed the merger papers. Brian Loton oversaw the steel division rationalisation. Neither man ever set foot on the Richmond machining bay floor. Neither had to. The customer, at scale, is always potentially the executioner. Lesson 3. The foundry that built Australia is now a shopping centre. Vickers Ruwolt built the 25-pounder gun-howitzers that armed Australia's Pacific War divisions. It built the main columns of Yallourn Power Station. It built the crushers and mills that dug Mount Isa, Broken Hill and Kalgoorlie. It built the sugar mill rollers that crushed the Queensland cane. It built the machine tools that other Australian factories used. It built the gears that Wolfgang Sievers photographed in 1967. In 2026, on the ground where it stood, shoppers pushed trolleys through Victoria Gardens shopping centre. IKEA is the anchor tenant. The pattern is not unique. Bryant and May, Jacques, Kelly and Lewis, John Hine, Woodfast, Boddingtons, Astor, but Vickers Ruwolt was the largest. 1941, BHP orders crusher frames from Charles Ruwolt, Proprietary Company Limited, 1983. BHP absorbs Vickers Ruwolt into Comsteel Vickers Limited. 42 years between the customer relationship and the corporate absorption. Read that again. The customer became the executioner, Charles Ruwolt at Wangaratta, 1902. Charles Ruwolt at Richmond, 1912. Charles Ruwolt on the Munitions Board, 1940. Charles Ruwolt dying at Toorak, 1946. Vickers Limited buying the works, 1948. Wolfgang Sievers photograph, 1967. Whitlam's tariff cut, 1973. BHP's merger, 1983. The Richmond closure, 1985. The Ruwolt name dropped, 1995. Victoria Gardens Shopping Centre, 2003. 83 years of Australian heavy engineering. 23 years of retail floor space and counting. The Foundry is a shopping centre. The gears are a photograph. She's a beauty.